Hello, my name is Noel Kingsbury and I'm going to be talking about early summer perennials. Now I'm aware that as this blog post is going out, we're pretty much on the cusp of turning from early to mid-summer, so I'm going to focus to a large extent on those ones that for one reason or another do look pretty good through the rest of the year. Now, early summer perennials have various growth habits. A lot are relatively low and clump forming, and we'll look at the reason for this in a little while. Only a very few are narrow with a more dominant erect flower stem. There's a tendency for some to become summer dormant or scruffy. There are some that are spreading or creeping. And then there are a few which have a more kind of bulky shrub-like shape, and these can be particularly useful for structure in the border. May, June, more or less dying off by July. Aquilita vulgaris, a very useful plant I find, a perennial, a short-lived perennial, but in most gardens nearly always seeding, and you can get a wonderful range of colours and indeed different flower forms from a mixed packet of these seed. They may be short-lived, but they are very good at seeding around in most gardens with incredible genetic variation, I find. They are one of these earlier summer perennials that really by July are pretty much finished, and because they are one of the few with a relatively narrow form, the fact that they're looking a bit scruffy doesn't really impact on other plants, and they certainly don't compete with other plants. So from now on, really, they'll quietly disappear until next year. And we can say the same really about Trollius, which I found in my last garden on damp Herefordshire soil would flower for months in early summer, but then from July onwards would be relatively inconspicuous. And one that always does almost completely disappear is Papaver orientale, which is a really spectacular, big, quite bulky poppy that flowers early, and is fairly notorious for becoming summer dormant and then leaving a bit of a gap in the border. But if it's surrounded by plenty of other later performing plants, that's not really a problem. And this is something that makes up for that by making very early spring growth, and we can actually make quite a feature out of its rather handsome toothed leaves as this emerges in March or April. Now, a lot of these early summer perennials are plants of meadows, meadows being a traditional European way of managing grassland, which would be cut in July, usually by mid-July, and then left to regrow. And that is a hay cut, so it favours species that can flower and seed before this. And indeed we find that many of these early summer perennials will take a bit of a haircut if necessary. The geraniums are a very, very useful group because they seem to be extremely resilient, very easy to grow in a really quite a wide range of climates, and in British conditions they make very early growth, and so very good at occupying ground and therefore denying it space to weeds. And they are classics really for June going into July. Geranium phaeum is a mainland European meadow species that coexists with grass very, very well. You can even grow this very successfully in rough grass. A variety of different colour forms, mostly quite dark. Lily Lovell is a kind of dark purple. There are others with sort of rather mysterious maroon, reddish shades, and one variety that's indeed almost black. Geraniums, as I said, are a very big and varied genus. Geranium sanguineum is a shorter growing one, a fairly nice tidy habit after flowering that's particularly tolerant of shade, so sort of dry, light shade under trees or other dry conditions, and flowers in very often quite strong shades of pink, although there's white or pale pink forms as well. Potentially, I think, a very useful one indeed. Another great favourite for this time of year is Alchemilla mollis, another originally meadow plant with particularly attractive foliage, Basically June flowering with these lime green flowers, a great foil for many other flower colours or indeed foliage colours like this sedge. But after flowering it's got these really good looking leaves, these scallop shaped leaves that can be quite a feature then for the rest of the summer. Euphorbia cyparissias, a low growing, quite strongly spreading a species, only about 30 centimetres tall, limey green flowers again in June, but this very attractive feathery foliage that can be very nice for the rest of the summer. A very good gap filler, it'll fill in spaces between larger perennials. Here it's growing below bamboo. Some people don't like the fact that it runs around so strongly, but for many gardeners they really welcome it as something that'll fill space between other plants and suppress weeds. Another one of very good foliage, Stachys macrantha, much more gently ground covering, May to June flowering, but with this very fine, really quite distinctive foliage that can be a good front of border plant or a good gap filler for the rest of the summer, and really quite an underrated plant, I think. Take a look at one more geranium for early summer, which is Geranium oxonianum. Now, there's a whole lot of geranium varieties with pink flowers, and everything from almost white through to really quite strong magenta pink. They're hybrids of two Mediterranean species, Geranium endresii and Geranium versicolor. And because they're from the Mediterranean, they've got a trick up their sleeve. And this is that they will make very early winter growth, because they're used to making most of their growth in a cool, moist Mediterranean winter. So in Northern Europe, they will carry on with a very long growing season. They generally flower in June, very often carrying on until mid-July. You can then cut them back, and they will then flower again in September, October, sometimes even until November. But that, even if you don't cut them back and put up with a sort of slightly scruffy mass of foliage, then they will repeat flower, and this is something that actually makes them very useful indeed. Unlike some of the other geraniums, they are very good growing in rough grass. Iris sibirica, however, will only flower once, as irises generally do, and that's very much in early June. But it leaves behind this legacy of very fine linear foliage, which will stand for the rest of the summer, indeed well into the autumn, and that makes a really nice change of pace with the normal foliage shapes of herbaceous plants. Baptisia australis is another one with fine early summer flowers that leaves behind a legacy of good foliage, in this case grey, a mass of almost shrub-like grey leaves, very good for cut flowers and is for flower arranging as well. And something that when you first see it, you find it hard to believe it's not a shrub but a perennial. Aconogynnon johannisvolker, which is still being sold under an incorrect former name of Persicaria polymorpha, is a knotweed relative, but unlike the dreaded Japanese knotweed, one that doesn't run about. This flowers more or less all summer, starting in June and carrying on through until September, starting off with these creamy white flower heads on a very big plant. This is invisible until May, and then it grows at a rate of about 3 centimetres a day until it reaches about 2 meters high and almost as wide, so almost a kind of shrub-like bulk, but on a plant that's only present during the summer. And as the summer advances, those creamy white flowers turn to this kind of rusty pink shade. Very attractive, although very oddly it seems to be of no interest whatsoever to bees or indeed any other insects. So those of you who want to attract pollinators to the garden might well end up ignoring it. But if you want something of shrub-like bulk with these rather attractive creamy flowers, then this may be a very useful plant for you. A great favourite of mine is Phlomis russelliana, which has these golden yellow flowers in June, but it's a 365-day-a-year plant because it has this pretty broad foliage, which then is really completely evergreen. Even in the depths of winter, this plant has some interest. And indeed, those flower heads are very stiff, and so they'll turn into good brown seed heads, which will stand the autumn and winter really well. So a great example of quite a rare example, really, of a herbaceous perennial that will give you interest all through the year. Veronicastum virginicum will also give you a good many months after flowering. June or July flowering with these very fine spires of tiny little flowers. This one's a white one. More usual forms are blue, violet, and some pinky ones as well. After flowering, this stays very upright, good statuesque vertical interest, and nice seed heads for the autumn. Runcus, this is very much a plant for woodland edge conditions. Fairly brief season of flower in June, but good looking foliage, giving you a kind of shrub-like bulk for the rest of the summer. And indeed, there now seem to be quite a few forms of it. Horatio is one with a much more elegant flower head and a slightly smaller overall shape of the plant. Now, astrantias are an early summer perennial, which are one of the few that will repeat flower more or less on and off through the summer. Very much a plant of woodland edge conditions. It likes it cool. It does very well in northern and Scottish and Scandinavian gardens, where it will very often self-seed. These rather attractive pincushion flowers, usually white, but quite a few garden varieties in pink or red. This does repeat flower, but a bit unpredictably, but something that will grow in close coexistence with a lot of other plants. It's got these very bendy stems that can wend their way through the foliage of shrubs or other perennials, and it'll give you at least one other performance later in the summer. Self-seeding, as I mentioned, this is a Scottish garden where it's really self-seeded quite a lot. Also a very good cut flower, I'd point out. Catmints are another one that very often repeat flower. These are generally June and early July flowering. Quite useful because they have this sprawling, not exactly a ground covering habit because each plant stays at a very discrete size, but a very useful front of border plant. Slightly hairy foliage, which will suggest to you perhaps quite correctly that this is a drought tolerant plant of Middle Eastern or Eastern Mediterranean origin and used to coping with dry summers. And this is one of these early flowering perennials that if you cut it back, deadhead it after flowering, very often will flower again in September. As indeed will these meadow salvias. Now these salvias, this one is the favourite one at the moment, Caradonna, with these purple flowers and red calyces, is one of the Salvia nemorosa, or Salvia sylvatica types. They're East European origin, very, very drought tolerant, meadow plants that flower in June and July, or indeed some of them a little bit earlier. Again, give that a haircut, so taking off the dead flowers after flowering, and very often this will repeat flower in September. We've talked about flowering perennials so far. Well, grasses, my favourite for early summer with really good continuity is Calamagrostis Carl Förster, which has these wonderfully upright flower heads, which is a great contrast for lower perennials with this really strong vertical interest. This flowers in June, but the seed heads will stand well past Christmas. In fact, I generally cut mine back in February. So Calamagrostis Carl Förster, a very useful grass for, I would say, 3/4 of the year interest. Flowers, of course, are only a 9-day wonder, so perhaps we should consider foliage as well. Heucheras are very, very useful, very popular now for foliage starting really quite early in spring and carrying on well through into the autumn, although it has to be said their foliage does look best, it looks freshest in the first half of summer. This is Palace Purple, which is probably one of the more reliable varieties. There are a lot of new varieties on the market now. A lot of them, quite honestly, are not particularly long-lived plants, but this is one of the better ones. The other end of the spectrum, silver, Artemisia canescens. Artemisias are a very useful group, drought-tolerant plants with this fine blue-green, silver-grey foliage. Grasses, we've looked at calamagrostis for seed heads, and there are a few grasses that give you very good all-summer foliage. Haconocloa macra is a favourite of mine, much more tolerant of a little bit of shade than most grasses, with this very attractive habit, slowly spreading, with a habit that almost looks like it's been given a comb every morning. Lysimachia ciliata firecracker, purple foliage, looks very good earlier in the summer. By July it's beginning to look a little bit past its best. It runs around but is a useful gap filler between other plants. Bronze colour is a nice foliage contrast for early summer green foliage. Also in this shade is the shrub Sambucus, the purple elder. This is something that a lot of gardeners, rather than allowing to grow as a rather untidy shrub shape, cut it back every summer. It's one of these, every winter. This is one of these shrubs that can be treated more or less as a perennial because it makes this very vigorous spring growth, which indeed is the best way of keeping the foliage looking fresh and vibrant, and it'll also flower on new wood. So this is one of several forms with purple foliage that can be treated as a back of the border perennial, almost with an annual cutback for a summer long period of this very high quality purple foliage. Alchemillas, we mentioned Alchemilla mollis earlier. Some are more useful as foliage plants than flower. This is a nice neat little one that's very useful for front of the border situations or small scale ground cover. Pulmonarias, very attractive spotty foliage that a lot of people like. Spring flowers, which is the main reason for growing them, but in shady places their foliage can be very attractive for well into August in most situations, after which they can begin to look a little bit tatty, especially if they get too dry. Anaphylis, these are perennials with little sort of papery white flowers in July, but very attractive foliage from really quite early on. Shrubs with attractive foliage, not so many, but this has always been a great favourite of mine. The flowers are nothing to write home about, but this very attractive pleated foliage, which is a great contrast with perennials and quite a light, upright grower. Annuals are, for many gardeners, the mainstay for summer. Early summer period can be very colourful, especially if you've sown in autumn and allowed hardy annuals to grow through the winter. Cerinthe purpurea is a recently fashionable perennial that does very well from an autumn sowing, with these attractive purpley, rather mysterious purpley blue flowers amongst this blue tinged foliage. And a contrast in orange, the well-known English marigold, which has a very, very long flowering season starting early, and unless it gets very dry will flower through the whole of the summer. And perhaps even more reliable, Eschscholzia californica, the California poppy, which again is best from an autumn sowing, and this will give you a very long flowering period indeed, and in a mild winter they can carry on, in fact almost as long as far as Christmas. Foxgloves amongst biennials, short-lived plants of course, but classics for early summer and especially in situations where they can self-seed. Finally, shrubs, which are very much spring and early and very early summer flowering, so we're not going to really spend much time on them, just flagging up a few that are classics for early summer interest, such as Philadelphus, very big growers, perhaps not suitable for the smaller garden, but these wonderfully scented white flowers, a real Victorian favourite that many people still love, even though perhaps it doesn't have the most attractive foliage for the rest of the year, which I must say is something that can be said about a lot of shrubs. Lilacs are another early summer classic, but with a more tree-like habit. Rhododendrons, of course, are a great favourite for early summer, and in some cases with good foliage for later interest. Roses. Now, roses are very much most people's mainstay for summer flowering shrubs, and this is because there's been such a long history of rose breeding that we actually have a lot of hybrids that have defied their genetics, because roses generally just flower in early summer and that's that. But we do now have a great many that will flower through the whole summer, and in fact we've got rather spoilt by this and begin to expect this of too many other plants as well. So this is a rather outrageous photograph of myself with my wife and a friend in a garden in Germany beneath a cascade of romantic pink roses. Finally, we don't grow roses for foliage, but there are some that have really rather wonderful foliage that provides a feature in the garden even after they've finished flowering. And this big climber, wickwar, is one such, with very nice grey foliage that really makes a very good backdrop for perennials and other flowering plants through the summer. So that's early summer with as much interest as we can think about with those plants carrying on later on into the summer. And for my next blog post, we'll be looking at mid to late summer perennials.